Hey, Dr. C here with you. So, red meat, should you eat it? Should you not? Is it a health food? Is it harmful? Is there a certain amount that's good or bad? Not sure if you've seen, but there's been a lot of news stories lately calling into question the concerns and some calling into questions the possible benefits. It's gone both ways and it's been quite a lot to figure out. And I wanted to do my best here to share with you some perspectives on this current evidence and the state that we've got and our current data. Personally, I have no agenda on this either way. Just for full disclosure on my background, my orientation on this, some of the papers I read, the authors did disclose their status of vegan, pescatarian, whatever else, their food frequencies. And I don't know, it may have some relevance. So here's mine. I tried for years to be vegan or vegetarian. I really resonate with a lot of the arguments, especially the ethical and environmental arguments. In terms of the health arguments, I see a lot of strong evidence towards the benefits of plant foods. I've not seen strong evidence about the harm of animal foods. I've not found that data as robust. My personal health, I do a lot better with a plant-based diet that does include some healthy versions of animal protein, not a ton. I do some red meat, probably several times per month. I don't restrict it. I don't really go out of my way to add it in, but that's where I stand on that personally. So this one was really inspired by a recent news story, which was about a recent study. And this study was a meta-analysis, which means that it wasn't so much original research as it was a new analysis of existing data. And after completing this analysis, what was made it so, I don't know, viral and apt to catch a lot of headlines were the conclusions. The conclusions these researchers got is that we really have no clear evidence about red meat being harmful. The data that we had before didn't really show a significant effect size, and it was not strong enough evidence in general. It was not that clear that there weren't other confounding variables. So there wasn't really a smoking gun according to the most recent arguments. And the conclusion they gave was that any recommendation to change one's red meat intake for health status didn't have a strong basis in fact. So that received a fair amount of pushback from many who have made strong positions in the past, arguing about the dangers of that. And I want to explore both sides and also just the relevance of red meat in the diet in this piece. So hang on, let's do it. So for starters, in terms of just the nutritional content of meat, it's a high source of many important nutrients. You know, a 3.5-ounce serving of a lean cut, you can get yourself upwards of 25 or more grams of quality protein. This is a pretty well absorbed, high quality protein rich in essential amino acids. We're also going to get about 1/4 of your needs for niacin, about 40% of B12, pretty fair amount of B6, 18%. Iron, you know, it's that same serving, it's only about 12% of your RDA for iron, but it is a high quality heme iron, which is a type that's well absorbed. We're also going to get about 1/4 of our needs for selenium, about 1/3 of our needs for zinc. Those are all important nutrients, and those are ones that we can run short in quite easily. And they're ones in which they're not found in a lot of foods, and the foods that do have them can be sources or versions that are just harder to absorb and assimilate well. So we've seen data that shows correlations, that shows that high meat intake can correlate with risks for diabetes, heart disease, early death. And some have argued that this is only true for processed meats like smoked and cured meats, bacon and sausage. The difficulty is that and the cancer risk it's inconsistent. Some studies show it, some do not. Some argue that the main evidence is observational. And observational data should not be dismissed. There's many, many areas to where we will never have large interventional trials. They just cannot be done. And observational data is far from meaningless. That's how we learned about smoking and lung cancer, for example. Kind of an interesting story on how that one evolved as well. But a pitfall is that most of the larger observational studies didn't correct for known variables that could contribute to the outcome. Specifically, many who have high red meat diets tend to have other risk factors for just unrelated reasons. People that eat the most red meat in general are more apt to be male, more apt to be older, more apt to be less active, often consuming higher amounts of overall processed foods, often lower amounts of education, and often lower in socioeconomic status. and higher rates of smoking, tobacco use. So these are confounding variables. And the more studies do work to try to correct for the confounding variables, the smaller the effect size seems to be for harms from red meat. Once you control pretty thoroughly for those, not a lot really pans out. Now, in science, our gold standard has been the randomized placebo-controlled study for good reason. Whenever we can do that, it's just so helpful. And it does differentiate a lot of other confounding variables like that, but also other types of bias and error and expectation and the mindset that fits into that. So we've had a couple of studies that were not blinded, but they were interventional, in which groups were given specific diets and other groups were not. And in those interventional studies, what we've seen has been rather surprising. Those have shown that swapping out red meat for poultry or fish doesn't really seem to have an effect upon blood lipids, cholesterol, or triglycerides. Another study that was done that was interventional showed that meat did have more of a benefit than other foods for helping muscle growth in women who were exercising. So they ended up with more favorable composition. And if that one did control for protein, it would have been a little more impressive, but they did show that per calorie, meat had stronger benefits than other food types. Now, another interventional study that might surprise some is that red meat intake actually lowered an inflammatory marker, interleukin-6. And this was an interventional trial, so the real gold standard. So that's what we've got from interventional studies. There haven't been very many. Now, we have had a long history of observational studies, again, showing that there may be higher risks for chronic disease, cancer, early death. The more thoroughly they control for certain variables, the weaker that data gets. And also, by and large, there's not a lot of control that goes on in those studies for variables like grass-fed, organic, or whether or not they're highly cooked or burnt. So I want to get a little bit deeper into the most recent study and some of the findings that it had, just to illustrate this concept. So I'm going to pop an image up and share an image with you guys. Here we go. Okay, so here's the image I wanted to share with you that just shows some of the data from the more recent analysis, the recent meta-analysis. In terms of cardiovascular mortality, what happened was over 10.8 years, for every 1,000 people, there may be 4 fewer deaths, between 4 to 5 fewer over 10.8 years. So not saying that 4 people died, but 4 fewer died. There's still deaths that occur, but there could be 4 fewer per every 1,000. And the argument was that the effect, the certainty, now how certain was that? So that's the effect size. How strong was that effect? Well, that's a small effect. You're not talking about everyone. And this is a difference of about a change of 3 servings or more per week. So if you're going down by 3 servings per week, you may have 4 fewer deaths per 1,000 people per roughly 11 years. So it's not everyone. But then they also look at how certain this evidence was. And what they showed was that it was quite low. There wasn't a high degree of certainty considering things like the variables that I mentioned. In terms of processed meats, which is here in this middle column, then we're seeing a similar trend. This is also a bit lower with not high degrees of certainty. And then type 2 diabetes, similar things. We're looking at about 6 episodes per 1,000 people per 10 years, overall cancer risk, perhaps 7 per 1,000 people over the course of a lifetime. So, but the certainty was weak. Now, the big difference, the big distinction between this data and the study that was released and prior studies was not the information. There wasn't new information here, but it was how they looked at it. And they said rather candidly that with small effects and high amounts of ambiguity, they didn't feel you could make a confident statement based upon that. They weren't saying that there's signs of benefit. That has not shown up. They did agree with prior findings and prior assessments that there are signs of risk, but they said, hey, let's talk about how certain are we of this risk and how large is this risk and how meaningful of a change would this create for people if they put energy into this. And one could take that data and say, if there's any risk whatsoever, we should act on it. And their argument was, well, you can't always act on every risk. Some risks are so small. You're always at risk for getting struck by lightning. Believe it or not, even on a day when there's no clouds in the sky. but that risk is so small that most of us are pretty feel safe going outside. So their argument was, rather than take the ultimate precautionary principle, let's be candid, let's be honest with people, and let them choose based upon how strong these risks are and how clear the evidence is. So that was their stance and how it was distinct. And the other perspectives that have come were more so from the idea that any risk should be discussed and called out. And it was almost an idea of public health as, I don't want to make this sound derogatory, but public health as nanny or nursemaid, or not so much that people can think things through for themselves, more so that people need simple sound bites and clear answers, or else they'll be uncomfortable. And I have mixed feelings about that. For sure, there are times in which we struggle with nuanced messages, but I think we've got to be honest. We've got to just share data for what it is and let individuals make up their mind. It is true that simple sound bites are more effective and they achieve more action. But what if they're not honest? What if they're not disclosing the data as it really stands? The problem with that is consumers become mistrustful because it all seems to flip-flop. There's never been radically different evidence, yet it seems that things change radically from week to week about eggs or butter or meat or whatnot. And that's because nuanced, complex evidence is jammed into simple sound bites of good or bad or more or less. And that's why it seems to flip-flop, because subtle differences, refinements, are taken in a different direction. So I would argue that consumers do deserve just the honest truth and the most accurate data about that. So the overall takeaway from that is there may be some health risks to red meat. We don't have strong data saying that just yet. There are nutrients in red meat that are hard to get from elsewhere. That's pretty straightforward. But as far as the health effects, if that's the main concern, that harm is not clear, it's not strong. I would argue that you can do better off by focusing on clean versions of meat, those that are leaner overall, have less total fat. The fat portion doesn't contain any essential nutrients. There are trace amounts of omega-3 fat in grass-fed meat, but by trace amounts, I mean trace amounts. We're talking like 20 milligrams, where you're shooting for 2,000 milligrams per day. It'll never have a meaningful effect upon your total targets. So the fat is not the source of any of the nutrients that are essential, but it does have the strongest correlation with the negative outcomes. So leaner types, if they're not highly charred, not highly burned, there is data about possible negatives from the compounds that form from cooking at very high temperatures. And those are things that can be reasonably considered in a healthy diet. So this is not going into the ethical concerns. This is not really addressing the environmental concerns. I would say briefly, though, that the farming itself makes up about 6% of our carbon emissions. And of that 6% that farming makes up, the use of animal growth and animal husbandry seems to be about 2.2% of that. So this is about if cows were gone, this might be 2% of our carbon footprint. Not none, but not everything, and one could offset that. And the other pitfall is that even if they were gone, we would then eat more of other foods, and they still have their effects upon carbon. Nothing is carbon neutral. For sure, the effects of raising animals has a bigger impact than directly raising plants, but it's not none. So it's worth thinking through. What I'm really excited about that could hold promise for the future is this idea of cultured meat. Theoretically, in a matter of a few years, we may not need to grow cows to have beef anymore. And I don't mean anything fake or GMO or synthesized. I mean beef, the same thing. And we could even choose the parts of it that we like the most nutritionally and cultivate types that are most targeted in those nutrients and avoid the ones we don't want. If we want to minimize heme or TMAO, or if we want to heighten zinc or whatnot, we could do that. And without there being any harm to animals, without there being any significant environmental footprint. So I think that's super promising. Even the World Resource Institute has said that by 2050, if people are consuming ruminants, there's a threshold that's not relevant. And that's somewhere around 50 calories per person per day, they're arguing, which would be averaging about a couple ounces, ounce and a half or 2 ounces per day. So not every day. That's a reasonable serving a few times per week, could have a negligible environmental impact. Humanitarian concerns, no way to address that directly apart from moving towards cultured meat. But as far as health negative effects, there's not strong arguments about meat being harmful. I wish it were cut and dry and simple, and we had like villains on this side and good guys on that side. But when we're talking about unprocessed foods, the data just doesn't support that view. So that's it. I hope that's useful for you. Dr. C with you, and I'll talk in really soon. Bye-bye.